Hello YouTube, Raul here. In today's video we're gonna continue with the Redux Saga beginner tutorial. This time we are going to look at some more advanced features and dive deeper into all of its components and everything it has to offer. If you missed the previous video, you can find it linked in the description below and also in the card at the top right corner. Before we get started, let me show you the starter project that I have created for this. So you will have a link to my GitHub repository in the description below. There you can go to the starter advanced tutorial branch, and here in this branch clone it, run npm install, and come back to this video so we can continue with it. Now let me show you around the starter project. If you don't want to clone it or just want to write it all by hand, I'm going to show you what I have here. So I have a module called auth, which has an input for an email, an input for a password, a switch between register and login. So we can click on it. Here it's the auth component. So we have three use states, one for email, one for password, and one for is register, which is this toggle right here. Then we have a button that if we click it will dispatch an auth start action, this one right here, with the data email, password, and is register. And we will handle calling the server that will authenticate us from the API. So we will handle if we send a register call or if we send a login call based on this boolean right here. Then I have an actions folder which has the auth start, success, and fail action constants, and again with the same for logout. And then we have the action creators. After this we have the auth reducer. So in this auth reducer we have four pieces of state. One of them is called is loading. The other one is logged in, which is going to be a boolean. Then we have a user, which later on is going to be an object when we get the data from the API. And we have an error state, which is going to contain our error message if we get an error. In the store folder, we have a normal setup for a Redux store. So we add the Redux DevTools, we also add the Redux Saga middleware, and then we run our root saga, which I'm going to show you in a moment, and we export default the store. The root reducer just takes the auth reducer from the modules folder and exports it inside the combine reducer. I created everything so that you can just integrate these pieces of code into your project, so you don't have to change too much to it. Then we have a root saga, which gets the auth saga from the authsaga.js in the modules folder and adds it to a yield all, which will run all the sagas in parallel. For the moment we just have one, but if you want to add more sagas, you can add them inside of this function right here. And then in app.js we have the auth component. In index.js we add the store to our application. And then the last one is the utils folder, which in the api.js has a Firebase project initialization with three functions, one for registering a user, one for logging a user in, and one for logging a user out. The first to get an email and the password. That's why we have just an auth action right here. We don't have separate actions for logging in and for registering because we just need the same data for them. Also in firebase.js I have the Firebase config. This config won't be valid when I release this video because I accidentally committed it to the GitHub repository. So yeah, that's my bad, but I'm gonna delete this configuration from my Firebase account, so don't bother copying it because it won't work. You will have to create your own Firebase account. In Firebase, you just create a new account and initialize a new web app. If you want me to do a tutorial on how to use Firebase in React, let me know in the comments below and I will make a tutorial to show you how to use them. I'm not going to create the Firebase configurations here in this video and the API calls to Firebase because I just want to focus on Redux Saga. That's why I created this starter project. So if you didn't go to my GitHub repository, clone it, run npm install, and let's get started. So we're gonna go into auth.saga.js, and here this is the only file that will actually work with in this tutorial. So let's implement the authentication for the first feature from Redux Saga that I want to talk about is another take. This time is a simple take. In the last video we looked at take every, take latest, and take leading, which would expect an action, would wait for an action to be dispatched and call a function. Every time that action was dispatched, they would call a function. Now take, on the other hand, works a little bit different. It pulls in a future action. So let me show you what I mean by that. Let's create a generator function. I'm gonna call it auth flow, and inside of this auth flow we are going to use a while true, so an infinite loop. Normally in JavaScript this is really bad and you should never be doing this, but inside of generator functions you can do this because they are paused by the yield keyword, so they don't block the rest of the application from running if you have an infinite loop inside of a generator function. So inside of this loop we are going to create a new constant. Let's call it action, and this is gonna be a yield. Then we're gonna take, and here we have to give it just an action, not a function as the second parameter this time. So let's import from the auth actions. Let's get the auth start, and we're gonna put this auth start here inside of the take. This will, because we have an infinite loop right here, will run every time auth start action is dispatched. So let me show you how that works. I'm gonna just console log the action, so what we get from this yield take. Let's save, and I'm gonna refresh the page. Then I'm just gonna write something in these inputs. It doesn't matter for now because they're not connected to the API. And if I press the login button, nothing happens. I forgot to add the auth flow to the yield all at the end in the export default. Okay, let's try that again. So I type something, and when I click login, if we look inside our Redux DevTools, an auth start action was dispatched, and in our console we see the action, so the object that we receive from yield take. It contains the type of the action that was dispatched, in our case auth start, and the payload, which has the email, the isRegister, and the password. They are dispatched from this auth component right here in the authenticate function. Now let's use this. So I'm going to replace this action. I'm gonna destructure the payload from it because we don't need the whole action, so we don't need the type basically. And now let's yield a call. So we used this in the previous video. Call is used to call a function inside of a saga, and to this call we can pass as the first parameter a function. So let's create a function that should be called, another generator function that's gonna be called authenticate, and let's pass it as the first parameter to this call, and as the second parameter we are going to pass the payload. So the object that we receive from our auth component. Inside of this authenticate, we are going to again use a try catch block, and we're gonna follow a similar pattern to what we used in the previous video. So in the try, we are going to put the call to our API, and in the catch, we're gonna handle what happens if that request fails. So let's do that. First, I'm gonna create a constant called data inside of this try, because at the end of the try, we are going to return something and we're gonna catch it here in the auth flow. So let me create a constant here. I'm gonna call it UID because I want to get the user ID from Firebase. Firebase has in the returned object has a user ID. So I created the data let right here. Now I'm gonna destructure the inputs to this authenticate function right here in the head of the function. So I'm gonna get the email, the password, and is register. Now inside of the try, we are going to check if it is register. And if it is register, then the data is gonna be equal to yield call to a function from our api.js in the utils folder. So it's gonna be this register user right here. So let me import register user and also login user from utils and then from API. Now we're gonna call this register user, and as the second parameter to call, we are going to pass an object which is gonna contain the email and the password that we destructured in the head of the function. Okay, so what this register user is gonna do, it's gonna make a call to the Firebase API, and if it's successful, is going to return us user data. If not, then it's going to reject the promise. Okay, so if it isn't registered right here, then the data is going to be equal to yield call to login user. And again, we are going to pass the same object with email and password. Then at the end, if everything is okay, then we are going to put an auth success action. So auth success, my IDE auto imported it right here for me. And inside of this auth success, we are going to put the data.user. So all the data that we get about the user. And inside of the reducer, here on auth start, we're gonna set a state to is loading. If it's successful, then we're gonna set the is loading to false. Then we're gonna set the is logged in to true. So if the authentication was successful, the user is logged in. And we're also gonna store the user data inside of this user key. If it fails, then we're going to expect an error as the payload, and we're going to set the loading to false, the logged in to false, and the user to null, just to make sure we don't have any data about the user if anything in our authentication fails. So we dispatch this yield put, but remember that we await a UID right here. So let's return that UID. It's going to be in data.user.uid. Let's also handle the catch really quick right here. So we're gonna put another action called auth fail, again from the auth.actions, and inside of this auth fail we're gonna put error.message. Okay, so this should be pretty much it for authenticate. I'm also gonna console log this UID when we receive it. So let me refresh the application. Let's switch to register because there is no account at the moment registered for this Firebase authentication. So let's put test1234 at test.com and let's add a password. Then I'm gonna click register and see what happens. So an auth start action was dispatched. Then after the call was succeeded, we got the auth success. And if we check the action that was dispatched, we get this payload right here. So this is the everything that Firebase has on this user. And we console logged the user ID. So our user ID successfully got to this point. Now, what about the logout? So that's gonna be really quick. So we're gonna check here if we have a UID. So if that exists, because if the UID doesn't exist, we don't want to be waiting for a logout action. So we don't want to do anything about it because we don't already have a logged in user. Here we are going to again yield take. This time it's gonna be logout start. So if I click this, my ID will import it from again the actions. And then we are going to call another function that for the moment we don't have created. So let's create it. It's gonna be function logout. And inside of this generator logout function, we are going to handle our logout logic. So let's call it from the auth flow right here. Okay, now inside of this logout, we are going to do pretty much what we did in the authenticate. So we're gonna have a try catch block. In the catch, we are going to put the logout fail action. So I'm not importing them by hand, but my IDE knows about these actions because I already have something imported from them and imports them automatically. If your IDE doesn't do that, make sure you import all of the actions that we're using. So we're gonna put the logout fail here and we're gonna again give it the error.message. And in the try block, we are going to yield call the logout function, logout user function from the API. So you can see it imported here. We don't have to pass any parameters to it this time. And if that succeeds, then we are going to put the logout success action. We also need brackets right here. Okay, so now I'm gonna refresh. Let's again write that it was test1234@test.com and the password is gonna be test1234. And this time I'm not gonna register, I'm gonna log in. So if I click login, you can see the auth start action was dispatched, then the success, and we got the user ID and also the is logged in state set to true. And now if we look at the state here, we have also the user data. And if I press the logout action, you can see we got logout start, which set the is loading state to true, and on logout success, is loading is set to false, is logged in is set to false, and error and user are set to null. These are done here in the reducer. So on logout start, we set the loading. On logout success, we just return the initial state. And on logout fail, we set the is loading to false and error to the payload. So as I said, logout fail should not happen, but it could. Okay, now going further, I'm gonna continue using this auth saga, and we are going to insert some other functionalities from Redux Saga so I can show you how to use them and what they can do. Before we get another effect from Redux Saga, I'm going to create another generator function and I'm gonna call it long running yield. So what I want to do in this is just have a function that runs for a really long time. To do that, we can get from Redux Saga effects an effect called delay. With this, we can yield delay, and inside of this delay, we have to set a time in milliseconds. So I'm gonna set 5 seconds, And after that, I'm just going to console log hi. Then in the auth flow, so after the auth start action was dispatched and after we get a UID, so when the authentication was successful, I'm going to yield call, and I'm gonna call the long running yield. What I want to show you here is what happens if between two parts, because our application will pause at this point right here until this finishes. So, or at least our sagas will pause at this point until the long running one finishes. I'm gonna refresh before, so I don't have to fill in the inputs and outputs. I'm gonna go into auth.js and type them here real quick, because I don't like to keep writing all of them. Okay, so now we have them here. I won't have to write them time and time again. Now, if I press login, and then until this delay is finished, I'm gonna press the logout button. So login, and then I press the logout. See, we get a logout start dispatched, but no logout success, and our state is still there. So the user pressed a logout button, but he is still logged in. And if you're displaying a spinner based on this is loading state, then he still has a spinner running and no way to cancel that spinner at the moment. And you see here our console log. Let me just make this tiny bit bigger. Okay, so this is not good because now we have something that interrupts our normal flow. So what can we do so that our logout action is still taken into account and it's still run? Because if the user clicks the logout button while our saga is busy doing something else, then the logout action should still be dispatched. So for that, Redux Saga has another effect which will create another thread for running sagas. So this effect is called fork, and we can replace the call function to it. So we're gonna just replace fork, and we're gonna replace the call with fork, and this fork effect will be run separately from the normal thread of the saga, so from this auth flow. Now if I save, refresh the page, now if I click login and then quickly log out, you can see that my logout start was dispatched, then the logout success was dispatched, so it worked, and only after that we got the high console log. So this means it works. Let me show you again. So login, then log out, and after a few seconds we get the high right now in the console. Okay, so this way we can create separate running sagas from our main flow. But what happens if that separate saga that we created with fork throws an error? So for that, I'm gonna create another generator function. I'm gonna call it throw error saga. Okay, in this we're gonna put again another delay of 1 second. So 1 second after this starts running, we are going to yield call, and inside of this call we are going to create an anonymous arrow function from which we are just going to throw an error with capital E, and I'm gonna write new error from saga. Okay, so now let's fork again this throw error saga after the long running yield. So yield fork throw error saga, and now I'm gonna save, and look what happens. So I'm just gonna press the login now, and let's look at the console. So I press the login, after 1 second we get an error, So new error from Saga is the one that we dispatched. And now doesn't matter if we wait for the 5 seconds of the long running yield, because that will not happen anymore, because fork creates an attached Saga. So if the forked Saga throws an error, then this whole auth flow right here and also the rest of the Saga will be blocked. So now I can't go, for example, press logout. You see we get the logout start, but the logout process doesn't happen. So the logout API call doesn't happen. For this, if we want detached sagas, so sagas that if they throw an error, they won't affect our main Saga flow. So you can use this for actions that are completely unrelated. There is another effect called spawn. So let's import spawn from Redux Saga effects. And now let's replace our fork to the throw error Saga with this spawn. Now let's refresh. And again, I'm gonna press the login button. Auth was success. The error was thrown, but you can also see our console log to high. So that means our Saga wasn't blocked by the fact that there was an error thrown. So I just threw an error manually here, but you could pretend that this error was thrown by another API call. Maybe you didn't get the path right, or you didn't find items or anything like that. And now we can also press the logout button. And logout still works. Going further, now I want to show you another case. So I'm going to refresh the app and I'm going to comment out the spawn to the throw error because I don't want my console to keep showing that error. Now, what happens if, for example, let's pretend this long running yield is a call to the API and the console log is the data that we receive from the API. What happens if I press the login button? This would be a fetch of data, but then until the data is fetched, I press the logout button, so the user leaves. Do I still want that data? Normally, you don't want that data anymore, and you should cancel that task because the data should not be received anymore, and you could potentially show some sensitive data to someone who isn't logged in like this. So what I mean by that is I press login and then I press logout. I get the logout success, but after 5 seconds I still get the console log to high. So this could mean I could show sensitive data to someone who actually logged off. To cancel that task, first we can store the forked Saga, so reference to the forked Saga, inside of a constant. So I'm gonna call it forked Saga. And if we want to cancel a forked Saga, we can import the cancel effect from Redux Saga effects. And inside of this if the user logs out, we are going to yield cancel. And to this cancel, we have to pass the constant in which we stored the reference to the forked Saga. And now if we refresh the page, now if I press login and wait for 5 seconds, then nothing's gonna change. So we won't get the cancel. And I can press logout now and nothing's gonna happen. So it doesn't have an effect if we don't press the logout button while the forked Saga is still running. So let's refresh. Now login, after login success, I press logout. Then we get the logout success and we can wait as much as we want because we won't get that console log to high anymore. Now the last thing I want to show you is how you can create a race between two different effects. For that, we are going to comment out this authenticate function and we are going to create a new one. So again, generator function, we're going to call it again authenticate. Again, we are going to destructure our email, password and is register. I commented out and not replaced the code inside it because you will find the code in the GitHub repository that I will have linked in the description below. There you will also find the code for the previous video and both starter projects. So inside of this, we are going to again use a try catch block. In the error, I'm going to just copy yield put error auth fail. So the same one as we did before, because we won't change anything to the catch. But inside of the try method, we are going to do something a little bit different this time. So we are going to check if is a register. And if it's not, so in the else, I'm gonna just do this for the login. We're gonna pretend that the register works the same as before. I'm gonna leave it blank so I don't have to type the code right now. So in the else, so if we want to log in, instead of just calling the register user, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get another effect from Redux Saga called erase. And here we are going to create a constant, and we're gonna have two different items in this object. So in this structured object, so we're gonna have data and we're gonna have timeout. You can name these whatever you like, just I'm gonna tell you when to name them again accordingly. So we're gonna yield erase, and to erase we have to give an object with as many effects as we want, and only the first one will finishes running will be completed. The other ones will be cancelled when the first one finishes running. So here inside of this object, we are gonna give again these two keys that we have in the destructured one at the beginning. So data is gonna be a call, and here we can call login user with the email and password object as the second parameter. So exactly like we did before. And the second one, the timeout, is gonna be a delay. We don't have to put yield this time before them because it's the race that's being yielded. So we're gonna call delay, and with, let's put 1000 milliseconds for now. Oh, I mistakenly put them in the is registered, so I'm gonna cut them and put them in the else block. And now, after this finishes running, we can check if we have data. So data will be undefined if the data effect wasn't the first one to finish running. So if we have data, then we can dispatch this auth success action, and with the user data that we received. And also here we can return the data.user.uid because we waited here in the auth flow to get the UID in the constant. And else, so if the timeout finished first, we are going to put an error. So we're going actually not an error, but an auth fail dispatch. And here I'm gonna just type a message by hand. So it's gonna be the login didn't finish in the accepted time, for example. Okay, so now if I refresh the page and press login, you can see it still works. So the auth success was dispatched successfully because the delay is 1 second, and if you look at it, it takes less than a second to get a response from the Firebase API. Firebase is really quick, so 1 second is too much, but let's put 1 millisecond here, save, refresh the page, and if I press login, you see we get auth fail. With the payload, the login didn't finish in the accepted time. So this way, you can make sure that only the fastest effect runs. So this was it for the Redux Saga Advanced Concepts beginner tutorial. I hope you enjoyed learning about all of the different effects from Redux Saga, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to be notified when I make future content. The next video is gonna be a bigger project in which we are going to use Redux Saga and also Redux Toolkit from my previous video series. Thank you all for joining, see you next time, and have a great day.